This past Christmas, my wife gave me a shirt, plaid shirt, you might call it, flannel-looking shirt. It was a surprise. I mean, a lot of things at Christmas I've asked for. I've given her a real specific list. I would love it if you would buy me these exact few things. So every now and then she'll have a gift where I genuinely don't know what it is. So she handed me this one, and she said, this one's a surprise. And so I thought, oh, well, that's neat, a true surprise. And so I opened it up, and it's this plaid shirt. And so I thought, a few minutes go by, and I've set it to the side, and we're about to leave. We were going to go visit family. And I don't usually wear flannel shirts. I'm extremely hot-natured. And very hot-natured. That is a whole other explanation. But I thought, you know what? She got it for me just out of wanting to please my wife. I went and put that shirt on. We show up at my parents' house, and my brother-in-law, his wife had gotten him the same shirt. I thought, what are the chances? And I walked into the house. My mom got my dad the same shirt. And I'll be really frank with you, I still didn't catch it. It wasn't until the next brother-in-law shows up in the same shirt that I thought, oh, I'm the butt of a joke. You know how the joke works. So 6 men, all grown men, all show up on their own accord wearing the same plaid shirt. There's pictures, I'm sure they're floating around on social media still to prove it. But all the wives played on the exact same thing. That these guys, they may not really want to wear this shirt. It may not have been the favorite shirt of all time. But if your wife is giving you this shirt and you know it's going to put a smile on her face to wear the shirt, which ironically this time I put the shirt on and she seemed especially delighted. But you're not really doing it for the gift. You're going ahead and put it on because you love the giver. So Jesus is walking us to that very same point. Would you be willing to change clothes for the sake of the one who gave you the clothes? Really, what is incredibly profound about this passage is what we find from correlation between Matthew and 1 Peter. If you've ever struggled with a sense of, I don't know if I'm saved. The end of this passage talked about chosen. You thought, man, how do you know if you're chosen? What we find is those who want to change their life for the sake of the King, not for what they get out of it, but for the one who gives the good things, has this incredible reassurance that they belong at the wedding feast of the Lamb. So it's going to put a whole bunch of pieces together, but I think it lands us at this incredible reassurance. It also confronts us, this parable. So the parable has 3 parts. We'll just walk through the parable. It's pretty straightforward. Part 1 is the invitation. Part 2 really is the gospel. And part 3 is the twist. So it's a rather straightforward in that sense. Its significance, I would say, is what makes it especially profound. The initial part of the story, part 1, is the invitation. So Jewish culture at this point in time had a slightly different process by which they would invite people or anticipate people might show up at a wedding or a feast or a banquet. So we have a very similar process in a more modern sense. Have you ever gotten a save the date card for a wedding? It precedes the invitation. So you save the date. It's for the people that they actually want there. And so they send out the save the date cards. They also send out an invitation at some point in time, and then that just kind of goes more broadly. So if you think in that sense, the king sent out initially a save the date card. He sends out this save the date card, and those who he really hopes will be able to attend know a wedding is coming. But there's also a little bit unique aspect to this culture that we might not see right off. We are very aware of time. You are very aware of time. So when you got the invitation, it said the wedding would be at 3 p.m. on November 2nd. Well, they don't have the same concept of time. I mean, nobody's walking around with a watch, maybe a giant sundial on their wrist. I mean, they don't have the same concept of time. They're not using calendars. I mean, you got a calendar in our pocket, and you got a calendar in your purse, and you got a calendar on your phone. We're very aware of time. What they would do is say, there's going to come a time when everything will be ready, and we will celebrate my son's wedding. I will let you know when everything is prepared. So that's exactly what this parable is playing on. A king has a wedding feast prepared for the son. So he calls all the people that he's initially gotten, you would say, an RSVP from. So we don't even have the first invitation. If you read it rather carefully, in verse 2 he says, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding feast for his son and sent his servants to call those who were invited. So they've already been invited. He's just calling them. They've already RSVP'd. He's just saying, now is the time. Well, he has his servants stood up by all of those who initially RSVP'd they'd be there. They've gone out. They've said the king is having his son's wedding feast. Our day and age, I think this would be hard to kind of wrap our minds around. Every now and then I will hear somebody compare this parable and this wedding feast to the president, if the president hosted a banquet. But I also know a bunch of Republicans that would not show up for Biden's banquet. And so I thought, I'm not sure that one works really. And so let me give you maybe a little bit better example. I thought that was really funny. It's a political season. All right, so what would be maybe a better sense? Mary Lincoln, in the middle of the Civil War, threw a party at the White House, and it was packed. So we can get a sense of it, that there are certain times in life, if somebody is throwing a party, it's going to mean so much to be there, even if it's a little inconvenient, even if it seems a little inappropriate, you still show up. So for these people to give what you might call lame excuses, petty excuses at least in verse 5, it says, one to his farm, another to his business. Really speaks to their heart. So this initial group that gets the invitation, this initial group that gets the RSVP, makes, on the one hand, a petty excuse. But the petty excuse is really just a veiled reason for their underlying animosity, which comes out in the very next verse. While the rest seized his servants and treated them shamefully and killed them. So Jesus is speaking very directly at this group, these religious leaders, the long-standing religious folks of his day. To that group, he says, playing on the previous parable, God sent prophet after prophet to you. You made petty excuses for why you would not turn back to God. And really, you got tired of people telling you, I think you need to turn back. I think there's going to be consequences. And you said, you know what? You said that one more time. And that led to them being treated shamefully and even killed. So then we have the king's response to those who've rejected his invitation. Initially, it sounds like a harsh response. Did you catch it in verse 7? The king was angry, and he sent his troops and destroyed those murderers and burned their city. You think, wow. Well, on the one hand, parables are not supposed to correspond perfectly with real life. On the other hand, if a mama has her daughter's RSVPs rejected, her sister RSVP'd to come to the wedding and then didn't show up, she sure talks like she's going to burn her sister's house to the ground. So we can maybe get a sense of it at least. from the emotional side. But really, Jesus is setting us up for part 2. All of that, you might say, he's covered in the previous parable. He's really setting us up for part 2. So part 2 of it is when they shift, and it becomes just invite anyone. In verse 8, then he said to his servants, the wedding feast is ready, but those invited were not worthy. Go, therefore, to the main roads and invite to the wedding feast as many as you find. Really, it's a beautiful picture of the gospel. They go out with this invitation, a gospel invitation. You can come to the wedding feast of the King. He's celebrating his son. And it goes out indiscriminately. It goes out to all. The indiscriminate nature is brought out in verse 10. And those servants who went out to the roads and gathered all whom they found, both bad and good. So now Jesus incorporates a moral component to it. Many people have discussed, what does the wedding feast represent in this parable? Some have thought it was the second coming of Christ. When he comes, and as we referenced during the Lord's Supper, people will eat with the lamb at the wedding feast. Others have said, no, this is his initial coming. A third view is that this is just anybody in the church is now the bride of Christ. Well, honestly, the parable doesn't point us in any particular direction. In fact, you could say it really encompasses all of those things. That you have an open invitation to anyone who would accept that you can come and have a relationship with God through his Son. And it doesn't matter what your background looks like, morally good or bad. And let me be real explicit with some of you. You read good or bad, and then you know the next section, the king walks in and finds a man who doesn't have the appropriate attire. And you say, well, maybe that's the bad one. Here's where I'm going to be explicit or technical. The Greek in which this is originally written writes the phrase both bad and good in the plural in verse 10. Then there's only one guy who's called out for the wrong attire. So there are many bad people who've come to Christ. There are many people who are sinners in a very open way, and it's known. And they're gladly accepted into the wedding feast. Zechariah 3 even builds on this because the implication of the passage is that when they came in right off the streets, and they all had wedding garments. So the implication is the king is handing out clothes to them as they come in. The reason I reference Zechariah 3 is in Zechariah 3, Joshua represents the people, and he's in a courtroom. And he has dirty clothes on, and he's standing before the judge who is God. The prosecuting attorney is Satan in Zechariah 3. Points over to Joshua and says, look at his stained garments. Which for Joshua, it's absolutely true. There are stains. He's tried to get them out. There's things from his past he's bleached over and over and over again. But the ugliness of it is still there. To which the judge says, bring him new garments. It's exactly what this king does. The king intervenes and he says, I'm going to take away all your old dirty garments. I'm going to take away all those old stains, all those things that you feel like people will notice. They're going to see I tried to get that spot out. They're going to know my past. They're going to know where that comes from. And he says, I'm going to take it all away. And I'm going to supply you with new clothes, these brilliant wedding garments. For some in the room, you're going to notice the weight is on this third part of the parable. But I would prefer you stop here. For some, we're going to move on and what part 3 entails, the twist. But you are convinced you're not really worthy. Some of you are even convinced you're not really worthy to sit in this room. The king invited you. And yes, if you show up at the king's feast, it is out of your league. But when you find out that he personally wants you there, he had garments ready, clothes that fit you perfect. And he's going to bring you in. And for you to come in and wear the clothes and to participate in the feast is going to put an incredible smile on his face. And you look around and you realize everybody else who's at the wedding feast is in the same exact position. The only reason they're there is because the king graciously invited them and he gave them clothes as well. They didn't clean up their clothes. It is only the gracious provision of the king. So we oftentimes would find people would like to stop there when it comes to this parable. And we would like to stop at part 2. If I can be very frank, a lot of liberal theology stops at part 2. A lot of poor views of the Bible would say, that's exactly what Jesus wants. Everybody's invited. It is unconditional. All come. All come. You're all welcomed in. But then we get to part 3 in this twist to the parable we don't expect. Right? We get to part 3 and we find, but when the king came in, he looks around at the guests and he saw there a man who had no wedding garment. And he ends up in the outer darkness where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. You see, Jesus is not liberal or conservative when it comes to his theology. What he's doing is he's saying all are invited. Everyone's invited. But there are still conditions. Right? We want it either or. Either it's entirely merit-based, and I earn my way into the feast, or what's more prevalent in our society is it has no conditions at all. Everybody just comes in. So much so that this particular phrase really causes us to bristle under it. When he looks at him and he says, "Friend, how did you get in here without a wedding garment?" So the phrase friend, as we read through Matthew, we'll find out, is a polite phrase. But it stops at polite. The next time it will get used, or one of the next times it will get used, is when Judas comes to betray Jesus. And he says in chapter 26, "Friend, do what you've come to do." So it's this friend phrase that gets used here. And so the friend gets asked, "Where are your wedding garments?" There are some people, every now and then, you show up at a wedding, and they're just kind of too cool to dress up for the wedding. They wear jeans with the coat. It's a lady who says, "I don't care, I'm going to wear white. I don't care if the bride's wearing white. I'll wear what I want." And they show up, and you think, "I can't believe she wore white to her daughter-in-law's wedding." And so you have the apparel that we anticipate. To be real frank, we don't know the exact apparel anticipated at this point in time. But there was an expectation that the king provided clothes, so everybody who shows up will be wearing the correct apparel. This guy, though, he shows up and he says, "I shouldn't have to change to be here. I want a good meal, but I shouldn't have to change who I am to be here." Do you see the interpretation of the parable? If you've truly accepted the gospel invitation, you will want to change because it pleases the King. But there are those who accept the gospel invitation. They say, oh, I want heaven. I want to be in the wedding feast, but I don't want to change. I shouldn't be expected to change. They would say, yeah, I'm a Christian. To which we would say, why haven't you changed? Or to phrase it differently, we would say the person who claims to be a Christian but there's no change in their life sticks out like a sore thumb. So some will want to accept the gospel invitation, but they have no desire to change. Let me give you maybe an easy example that's pretty prevalent in our society now, as people even put titles to it. They'll say, well, I should not have to change my sexuality just because I'm a Christian. I'm just a gay Christian. But they're saying, I want Christianity, but I shouldn't have to change who I am. I don't think that's should be a part of it. So what Jesus is suggesting to them is that if you've come into the feast, you have to put on the clothes that please the King and honor the Son. So here's why I think this passage hits home for us. This passage, I would suggest, describes nominal Christianity, describes the predominant form of Christianity in the Southeast to a T. People who want to be known as a Christian, want to come into the wedding feast, have claimed to accept the gospel, but refuse to change. They refuse to change. They even want Christianity to provide things for them, like a good meal and a wedding banquet. But they do not want to have to conform to the King's desires. Let me show you where that lands these folks. It's such a harsh phrase, but I think it is helpful to see it. It says that causes them to be thrown into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth, for many are called, but few are chosen. If I can give you a translation from John Piper. There are millions of nominal Christians who believe God loves them and are on their way to hell. I think it's a very straightforward translation or interpretation. So what does nominal Christianity really look like? Let me try to describe it so that we can have mixed emotions within ourselves. Maybe this is me. Maybe I'm the nominal Christian. So I want to be a little more explicit. Here's how nominal Christians think. A nominal Christian comes to Christianity for the gifts that can be provided, but they don't care to please the giver. So their prayers will even sound like a lot of Christian prayers. They'll say, God, please help our marriage. I just feel like our marriage is on the rocks. Please help our marriage. God, please help us to get into that house. I know we offered under asking price, but it's just our dream home. Or so I want the gifts, but what never factors into my thinking is how I might please the giver. See, nominal Christianity prays that way, thinks that way, operates that way, because really, there is no difference. They're wanting the exact same things that they wanted from before they were Christians or claimed to be Christians. You don't have to be born again to want God to bless you with a house and a marriage and kids that act right, and etc. The difference is I now, as a believer, say, how can I please the one who would give the gifts? That's more my concern than anything else. What can I do that would be pleasing to him? What would it look like for me to say, God, we don't just want our dream home. We want a house that we can use to please you. A house where we will actually be able to reach our neighbors with the gospel. A house where we will be able to be hospitable, but a house at the same time where we're not so cash strapped we can't be generous. We want to buy a home that pleases you more than we want to buy our dream home. My dreams are going to conform to what he wants. They're going to change towards what he wants. I don't just want kids that grow up and have a successful job. I'm saying, God, how can my kids, through everything we engage with, be changed to be more conformed to the image of your Son? How can we be pointing them in that direction? How can we be pointing them to a clearer understanding of the gospel? What he's suggesting through the parable is, by definition, if we've accepted the invitation, change will occur. And those who've refused to change, they've refused to put on the wedding garments, were never chosen. The chosen idea, I know, might make some a little hesitant, because you think, well, it sounds like God just picks. And I would say, on the one hand, yes. It does say God chose. On the other hand, 2 Peter 1 provides a helpful insight. Verse 10, he says, therefore, brothers, be all the more diligent to confirm your calling and election. For if you practice these qualities, you will never fall. So now he's saying, election or chose, you can confirm that you've been chosen by seeing these characteristics more prevalent in your life. So if you were saying, okay, I'm willing to be conformed to what would please the giver, but what exactly is that? So if you don't mind me giving you a little bit of homework, it's 2 Peter chapter 1, verses 5 and following. 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 5. For if you read 5 through 7, he's going to give a list of qualities that would confirm your election. And he says, if these are present in your life in increasing measure, that's how you would know I am more centered on what would please the giver than receiving the gift. I'm more centered on showing up and changing in a way that honors the king than having a great meal at a wedding. I think for Jesus' parable to sink in with us, it requires accepting the twist of part 3. Not making a gospel where it's just everybody would come in and God will take you where you are and you just stay just as you are and nothing is expected. Because the Bible is very clear. God does take you where you are, the bad off of the streets, but then he conforms you into the image of his Son. Change is part of it. You might say there's never a dog too old to learn a new trick. Change is going to be part of the believer's experience. I'm going to be conformed in increasing measure, as 2 Peter describes, to the image of his Son. I think the invitation is also a beautiful, gracious invitation. If there's ultimately a wedding feast with the Son, and there's an opportunity for anyone to be in such right standing with God that he would love to recline at the table with you. And it comes about for all those who put their faith and trust in Christ. And we have this distinct privilege of changing different aspects of life that cause God to have a smile on his face when we walk into the room wearing the clothes he's picked out. Would you please stand as we sing this final song together?